We keep getting told the recovery is here, and technically, that's true. The data is improving. Activity firming. Confidence back at the wicket. But that doesn't mean everyone's innings has started. The recoveries don't lift all the boats at once. They reward positioning, not patience, and they tend to look generous from the pavilion while feeling very different at the crease. So, this isn't denying the recovery, it's about asking who it's actually reaching and who's been told to keep defending while the game moves on. We're joined again by Westpac Chief Economist Kelly Eckhold. Kelly, your report shows improving momentum, but it is from a weak base. In practical terms, who usually benefits first when a recovery starts? The players already set or the ones padded up?
Or, I think it could be the ones to pad it up and that'll be thinking about this. One thing that is still going on is that the players that made all the runs last year, that was the agricultural sector, the farmers. They're still doing all right, to be honest with you. The milk price is still pretty strong. Meat prices are out of this world. If you've tried to go anywhere near the supermarket to buy something for barbecue this summer, you would have seen that. But the ones that are padded up are the ones that have got the opportunity because they're probably looking at lower interest rates. And that could be anybody who's involved in the construction sector, for example. We can see that consents for new builds have really started to spike up in the last 5 or 6 months now. Starting to hear stories from the supply chain that there's increasing demand for building supplies and lumber and things like that. So that it's actually going to be quite good for that sector. And then retailers are really hoping that they're going to be seeing a much more active consumer this year and perhaps have a chance to potentially restore a few margins that they really struggled to maintain in the last couple of years.
The data shows business confidence lifting faster than labour conditions. Is that the top order settling in while the tail waits its turn?
Yeah, well, it's also the way it is. Usually in the cycle, what we see is activity lifts first and then labour lifts a bit later. So basically, in the last couple of years, we've had a situation where firms have probably held on to a few staff that they didn't technically need, but they didn't want to get rid of people only to have to hire them back later and potentially retrain people as well. So we're at this stage of the cycle where firms are trying to work their existing workforces a bit harder, as opposed to necessarily hire a lot more people straight away. But the longer that they see good demand, after a couple of quarters or so, it'll get to the point where we can't work them any harder, but we're going to have to get a few more people in. And that's when the benefits of the economic recovery will become much more apparent to a much wider range of people.
How common is it for recovery to widen the gaps before it closes them?
I think it's pretty normal, and particularly if it's an uneven one where you basically got some sectors doing better than others, and I think that's certainly been the case in this one. 2025 wasn't universally bad for everyone, but it was terrible for some, so you kind of see those kind of like gaps there. We have to remember that there are always reasonable lags to any economic recovery. Now, the Reserve Bank starts cutting interest rates, and it could be a good year or so before you really see the fruits of that. And I think when I see some of the economic trends we've seen take hold in the second half of last year, it just reminds you of those lags.
Okay, well, when commentators or economists like yourself point to the fact that the economy is improving, what indicators are they pointing to specifically in New Zealand, and what are they leaving off the scoreboard?
Well, I think some of the best indicators have been in the construction sector, where you've seen residential consents rise quite considerably over the last 6 months. Business confidence is up quite strongly. Basically, we've seen firms reporting that the activity they've experienced in the last few months is now rising up towards the hopeful expectations they held over most of the last year. GDP itself has been quite strong. The manufacturing sector, the purchasing manager indices are now suggesting that conditions in that sector are probably a standard deviation or so higher than long-term averages. So they're not only just feeling average, they're actually feeling a bit better than average now.
Can an economy look stable overall while the household exposure is still increasing?
I think it can, because the business sector will probably do better first. But ultimately, there needs to be a balance between these things, because businesses don't make money unless customers are comfortable in spending.
When is a recovery real but not selective?
Well, I think we'll say that it's feeling real when we've had a quarter or two of a fall in unemployment rate. Because if it's got to that point, that means you've seen a decent amount of improvement in economic activity, and it will be filtering through to the broader labour market. And we're not there right now. We've basically got an unemployment rate that's just hovering around its peak, 5.2, 5.3, 5.4%. These numbers are all about the same. When we see that unemployment rate back down into the fours again, then I think you could probably reasonably say, yep, it's all on.
What do you mean in your report, which suggests that the Reserve Bank has time because slack remains?
Well, that's this idea that there's still quite a hole in the economy. A 5.4% unemployment rate is probably a percentage point higher than where it should be on average over the cycle. So that gap is basically the size of the hole. It takes a bit of time to fill that in. But the other thing I'll say that they have time is that they probably will still be forecasting inflation to gradually fall back towards 2% over the course of this year. And part of the reason for that is that there is that hole. So they know that a lot of firms are still going to be a bit restrained in terms of how much price increases they try to pass through. But also there are important categories of inflation that were quite high in 2025, but are unlikely to be so in 2026. And I'm particularly pointing to things like food prices. Global food prices have been falling in New Zealand dollar terms now for a good few months, perhaps sort of like 6 to 9 months. And that does seem to have quite a good relationship to what we see in the supermarket here. Doesn't mean that prices are necessarily going to fall in dollar terms, but the game for the Reserve Bank is, are they rising by more or less than 2%? And there seems to be a reasonable degree of confidence there that they're not going to be rising as much as we go through this year.
So that 2% forecast for inflation, from your perspective, and you've had so many years in the industry, is that realistic or optimistic?
So I think 2% is a bit optimistic. I don't think we're going to get down that far. I think we might see it get down closer to about 2.5%. But it's going to take us probably 2 or 3 quarters before we really know where this is going to settle. And while it's still moving in the right direction, I think the Reserve Bank will be fairly comfortable to basically say, well, we're going to sit here and assess. And hence, that's why I still think that an interest rate rise is on the cards in 2026. But I think it's a very late in the year affair as opposed to anything that might happen in the next few months or so.
Yeah, talking to you last year, essentially a Christmas surprise for an incoming government.
Yep, that's right. And actually, if anything, the data that we've had since then might point you to moving a bit sooner than that. I mean, the financial markets have a September rate rise priced in. I wouldn't call that my central scenario right now, but I can understand how that could happen.
I know you can't be too political, but I tell you what, for the coalition, just before the November 7 election, that would not be good for them.
Well, it depends on the context in which it comes, right? So I'd say the government, if they saw a rate rise after a period of strong economic growth and a falling unemployment rate, then they would probably focus their messaging on those factors, which would be probably better news, I think, for the electorate.
Yeah, except that most people will vote on emotion and they don't think as logically as someone like yourself.
Now, I tend to think, when we're talking about interest rate rises in 2026, we're talking about going from a very, very low interest rate to a still quite low one. I think it's filtered through to the public, I think, that they're not getting more rate cuts this year. They've seen the fixed rate mortgage rates go up, which is the indication that that's actually what's going to happen. But you have still seen consumer confidence improve. And that's because people, I think, are sitting back and going, well, I mean, if these mortgage rates end up in the fives, is that really the end of the world to me? It's a damn sight better, for example, than when they were in the sevens a couple of years ago.
That's Westpac Chief Economist Kelly Eckhold. Recoveries are real, they're just not evenly distributed. They reward those already in position. They test those who are still waiting for their chance. From the outside, the match looks like it's turning. From the middle, it can still feel like survival. Most mistakes aren't made when things are obviously bad. They're made when the scoreboard improves and people assume that means it's their turn to bat. Sometimes the recovery has started. It just might not have reached your turn yet.